presentation on Indian venture debt, the report. Our next panel discussion is with respect to asset monetization pipeline, assessing the progress, opportunities, and the issues. The moderator for this panel is Mr. Manish Agarwal, Partner, Head of Infrastructure and Special Situations Group, KPMG. The speakers for the panel are Ambalika Banerjee, Executive Director, Direct Investments, NIIF, Ami Momaya, Director, Infrastructure Investments, KKR, Kavita Saha, Managing Director, Infrastructure, CPPIB, and Saurabh Agarwal, Managing Director, Infrastructure South Asia, CDPQ, India. Over to you, Manish.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Manish Agarwal. I'm a partner with KPMG and I head Infrastructure and Special Situations Group with KPMG India. I have a privilege of having my co-panelists, each one of them, a leader in this particular space and an important subject that we are discussing or going to discuss about national monetization pipeline, asset monetization, the progress so far and the opportunities that we see for the private sort of a side of a capital here. So welcome you all again. I think I will just probably share a bit of my sort of a perspective and then go around all the co-panelists to have their opening comments, and then I have a few specific questions around the subject which I will pick up with the co-panelist here. Uh, I think if you really look at the asset monetization, it is not that India is trying to do it for the first time. We have done in the past. However, the difference this time, and then in the form of what the government came out through NMP, is that this is the first time where at least the government has attempted to lay out a clear roadmap over the next 3 to 4 years as to what and how the asset monetization actually will be carried out. That's a one big difference. So far it was done sporadic. You did one TOT, for example, then something in transmission, and then obviously the investors were left asking, okay, well, when is a likely and what is a pipeline that we can see over the next 3 to 4 years? The second is, if you really look at NMP or asset monetization program that the government came out with, this is again for the first time where they have laid out pretty much every sector where the possibilities exist to monetize these assets, which is again a very fundamental difference because so far it was limited to a particular sector, whereas here the government has said that pretty much every sector is open to do something like this. And I think the thought process, again, to step back at a strategic level, is to say that this is how we will churn capital, we will raise capital, and that capital goes to invest in the greenfield assets or a greenfield sort of sectors, because that is where the private capital, or let's say the investors pool, will find it really tough to come in. And I think the third one from my perspective, which is also very important this time, is that the states have also been nudged to probably do something like that in their own sectors. So far, in the past, the program has been limited to a more like a center, and given what they have given a good incentive for the states who carry out these programs, and the additional funding that comes without any sort of strings attached to it, is again a very good way probably to nudge the states. Having said that, we have always been we have always been witness to a lot of initiatives which, when they start getting executed on the ground, you find what are the challenges that probably comes across that, and probably through this panel we will try to assess some of those and some of the opportunities that the players are also seeing to make out of this NMP. So I have as I said, very esteemed co-panelist with me. Let me just go with the opening comments. Coming to you, Amy, first. What is your opening comments around what you see of NMP? What are the opportunities that you see? What are you excited about?
So Manish, let me start by saying the NMP, I think, introduced in the right structure, will be a massive positive for the government as well as for investors. Because, for us, let's break it into two parts. One is the whole government push. And we know the macro story in India remains compelling. It was also compelling a decade ago. And like you rightly pointed out, there were different sectors implementing PPP under different models at different points in time. It was not a coordinated effort. Roads went first in the late 90s. We had power, we had ports, we had airports and the like, right? But now what we see is a comprehensive effort and the government recognizing that scale is important. Scale and orchestrating that to get investor demand across the board is important. And from an investor's point of view, and a lot of people on this panel today know how difficult it's been for us to carry on, greenfield construction. It's not been an easy journey over the last 10 years when development was the only way for investors to enter the sector. Today, we have many assets that are operational, not only with government, but also with infrastructure companies that can actually be monetized to provide liquidity. And I think that's the story because there is the whole brownfield aspect of assets which can be recycled. It also makes investors comfortable because they're not going out of their way to take risks, which they cannot digest. So we believe that investors can digest their volume risk, pricing risks to a certain extent. But when it comes to land acquisition, when it comes to things that you really need your foot on the ground to actually manage, it becomes slightly challenging. So I do believe this is a perfect marriage between what the government is trying to achieve on the capex side and what investors are trying to achieve, because there is a massive pool of infrastructure financing capital that's available for the government to tap, and this is probably the best way to do it.
Thanks, Ami. Thanks. Ambalika, coming to you for your opening comments. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Manish. Sorry about all the technical glitches. I've finally managed to make it. So, hello,
Thank you.
everybody. Ami, Kavita, Saurabh. My opening remarks, I don't know what Ami has said, but I will say, yeah, I mean, I heard the last bit and I'm in agreement. I think it's really being responsive to to the capital that's out there and the capital that India wants to attract. The NMP is actually also a fallout of the NIP in a way because it envisaged equity financing coming in 5 to 6% from government sources. And, it has been made very clear that as of today, international capital does not really have the appetite for greenfield risks in India, not in the kind of, not to the extent of 6 trillion. So NMP is really the way forward. We have a large block of assets already constructed in operation. Government is not giving away ownership, but these would be done via concessions in some manner or form, whether in TOT roads or INVITs, or you have DBFOT or one of those various models or something new. And investors get, therefore, to an extent, at least assets that are de-risked to the extent of construction, and that is where the majority of capital lies. And you can always, perhaps get domestic capital or look at other structures for greenfield investment. So again, what government has, NMP has monetization has been tried before, uh, but this time I think there is clearly a very rational and logical approach to it, and hopefully that is really going to result in execution of that pipeline.
Thanks, Ambalika.
The
And I will come to some of the execution part of it, which I also mentioned in my opening sort of a comment. Kavita, your opening remarks about this entire opportunity, the way you see it. Uh,
Thanks, Manish, and hi, everybody. So I think having had the benefit, along with some of the other people on this panel, of being a part of the thought process behind the national monetization plan. So first of all, I would say what is unique about it is that a lot of investor input was taken even at the time of conceptualization of the national monetization plan, and some of the specific targets which were already put on the table, including the kind of capital that they were looking for, which was long-term capital in line with the kind of requirements of infrastructure, which is one very significant part of the monetization plan. The second is the routes to monetization. The strategic sale as well as capital market divestment were some things which had already been tried in the late 90s. But recognizing the tune of the market and bringing forth InvITs as one of these specific opportunities, especially for brownfield infrastructure assets, and especially designed at a different class of investors who are, perhaps not already there in the market or don't have their platforms or want a more well-governed, structure in which to invest, including for the very first time domestic institutional capital, right? I mean, so a lot of noise has always been made about foreign institutional capital and foreign funds and all, but this was one which was especially designed to also encourage long-term domestic institutional capital to come in a very systematic way and fund infrastructure. So I think that was, and the third and most important part was also getting states in. And Manish, you had mentioned that in your opening remarks, and the willingness to look at what has worked well, in other markets, specifically, let's say in markets like Australia, which had an incentive scheme for states to monetize, and trying to work that so that one to increase the complement of assets which can be monetized, and equally, address some of the risk issues which have already always been perceived with regard to the state monetization. I think those are some of the unique aspects that we saw in this round of the entire thought process. And I'm happy to say that, in line with walking the talk, we have not only been intrinsically a part of this think tank, but also have had the opportunity to participate in the first two InvIT monetizations which happened last year, which is the Power Grid InvIT as well as the NHAI InvIT in sizable manner. Thanks, Manish.
Thanks, Kavita. I mean, well put out across. I mean, what are the changes this time around, and why this is very different than what has been done in the past? Sort of your opening comments, please.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you all the co-panelists. Very well put. I guess very similar to what Kavita just mentioned, having been part of some of the initial discussions which led to the asset monetization plan, also the as actually NIP. I think the thing that I'd like to add here, and it is obviously it is quite clear as such, but I think it's important for everybody to note, NMP and NIP are not or shouldn't be thought of as separate things. They are quite related, they're hand in hand. What we are doing with NMP is creating opportunity for creating capacity, creating new management teams, and providing confidence to large scale, long term investors to ultimately gain the confidence to also build greenfield. And we've done that very successfully with two out of our three platforms, which were originally contemplated as just brownfield investments. They've now been there for several years, and both of them are doing very significant greenfield development in solar and utilities. So we see that as a great opportunity to acquire assets, learn, build the team, build the management, and then subsequently go and start bidding in more greenfield risk-taking capability. So I think that's how we should think about both NMP and NIP. At least we think about it that way. And I think key here is execution and monitoring of that execution. There are a whole host of challenges still in many different sectors. I think roads and renewables are fairly advanced, but there are other sectors that we are interested in participating. And of course, we would like to work with the government in the same proactive manner to make sure that we provide our inputs and open up opportunities in other sectors in a similar coherent manner and fashion that we have seen. Of course, we have also been participant in a different manner, not into the InvITs, but into the TOTs. And we think that both these options for monetizations, whether it is the TOT route or it is the InvIT route, they're both important, and they should both be given reasonable preferences. So that's my opening remarks. Thank you, Manish, and for
Thanks, Saurabh. And I think, I mean, one thing came out very clearly through these opening comments, that it's a very different and a very probably a big reform from that perspective. It looks at what the investors look at from a brownfield assets. We should look at in the overall cycle, as Saurabh you very rightly said, linking it with NIP, because you raise the resources and the government invests the resources to build a new capacity. And then there is a roadmap which is laid out, plus the states are being nudged for. So all good positives as to what this has to be looked at. Now, let's go to the next sort of a bucket, which is to look at, okay, since the announcement, what have we seen? Have we seen something which is a little different as to, I mean, sort of, and you mentioned that, and then coming to you, obviously, sectors like roads or renewables have been pretty evolved in that sense. You have seen a lot of efforts on these sort of sides. Obviously, the challenges remain, as you alluded to as well. But since the announcement of NMP, I mean, have you seen sort of, as per your sort of a take on that there are attempts, or there are sectors which has been pushed through, which was not there earlier. For example, from a monetization point of view, are there any concrete sort of a steps that you see has been taken on the ground versus what was happening earlier, and post the announcement of this entire initiative, both NMP as well as NIP?
Thanks, Manish. If I can react, I think here I would be a little, I would say, uh, not as
Circumspect.
enthusiastic. Okay, just to be honest, not as enthusiastic. I think both uh, Power Grid, NHAI, all these options, InvITs, etc., TOTs, they were all there in their own individual rights even before the announcements, and they were all already contemplated. What, however, this announcement has done is that it has brought a lot of this initiative has come to the limelight, and there is a lot of focus on this. Now, while we haven't seen much in other sectors, I have to say that it is not easy. I totally recognize the fact that it takes time to put together a framework like where NHI is today, or where, let's say, a SECI is today. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to put that framework together. So I'm hoping that other sectors are working through it, and at the right time they will come through. Those opportunities will come through. But honest, I haven't seen any concrete opportunities in other sectors other than roads and renewables.
So I think, Kavita, just picking that thread, and I mean, when we all were debating the construct of this entire NMP as well, one of the challenges, I mean, as Saurabh also said, was always about that once you have that sort of announcement and the framework, how do you really get it implemented and executed as well, so that the interest that you generate can actually be followed through. Now, in that context, I mean, do you feel that architecture which would have some specialized central agency working with the line ministry, where these monetization of asset has to be worked out, do you think, I mean, that would have been actually a little better way to ensure that each one of these ministries, or each one of these sort of houses which are at different stages of their evolution, would have actually been in the market as well? Do you think, something like that, there's a right time for the government to think that how do they actually ensure that what they've announced moves across the sectors rather than limiting to few sectors, which were anyway happening earlier?
No, absolutely, Manish. So, I think there were two, three aspects of that, right? And certainly in some of these aspects, certain things are common, right? So let us look at it first from identifying a set of assets which are suitable for monetization, and the NMP has sought to address that, right? The second part is the devil is in the details. What are the issues which can arise from a legal perspective, from a taxation perspective, maybe even from a land perspective, which Ami mentioned in opening remarks. It in some of these sectors, the problems are common. A legal problem, or let's say something as fundamental as ownership issues. Is this a concession? Are you passing on a license? Are you passing on an ownership in perpetuity? Those kind of things, they are very well addressed in a centralized fashion, right? uh, the third part is that you actually need somebody who can drive this project. take the accountability for it and say that, this is my target, this is how I'm going to get done, and these are all the things that various other people are going to do, and project manage that entire, that is actually missing, right? Because right now that project management is totally fragmented, that thought process is very fragmented, and therefore it is not very efficient. You are not able to take the learnings from one process and apply it to another process, because you're again reinventing the wheel from ground up, and which is what I think in our discussions we wanted to avoid. We said that if there is one central agency which is taking ownership for the outcome, there are line ministries which are kind of feeding in, what are the candidate assets which can be monetized, and kind of working with the central agency in terms of thinking through the timetable, the sizing, and all of that. It can operate a lot more efficiently. So right now, I think what we are really missing is that we have the body, we have the engine. We need somebody at the steering wheel to ensure that we are getting to that destination, and that is what really is required. And that has to be a central agency, given the fact that that is a common factor amongst a lot of these various line ministry and state ministry and various other agencies.
Thanks, Kavita. And I think, I mean, Malika, the same thread. What is your sort of a perspective? I mean, do you also concur with what Kavita is saying, that if we have to really move some of the sectors which we have not seen much of a success? I mean, while, and let's say, I mean, PPP in trains is a classic example where it was launched, 16 expression of interest, but by the time the final bid came, there were hardly any bidders. Do you think, I mean, it will make a difference as to if there is a centralized agency where a lot of this expertise is residing, and that brings a common thread as well, and the learnings working with the line ministry to really push some of these initiatives?
Thanks, Manish. We have discussed this point, internally, and I think the view that we have, and I agree with that view, is that execution per se, I cannot see being done by one centralized agency. Execution will remain with the individual entities like NHAI and PGCIL or whoever else, or the railways. Uh, but on the other hand, what a centralized agency could achieve is to be there to monitor, to track, to and also give guidance. So yes, to some extent, ownership and the drive to take things forward, to meet a certain timeline and plan should be centralized. In an ideal situation, that sounds great, and we should try and get something like that. Look at what are the common sort of approvals, etc., that you need, and how do you address it, and how do you remove all these bottlenecks that arise. And some of them are really common, and land, I think, is one that's cropped up. But beyond that, actual execution will have to come from each of the individual agencies. And I do see that happening. I mean, we've beyond the sectors. I mean, that we do a fair bit of greenfield in renewables. But what is beyond the roads, renewables, and the usual sectors? I am seeing some traction in railways, but we can come back to.
Okay, sure. I think let me then now move on to the some of the sectors, and Emmy, coming to you. I mean, apart from, you have a couple of platforms already there, right? I mean, you have a roads platform, you have renewables as well as transmission. Now, given the NMP is a quite vast about the sectors, what are the other sectors of interest outside these? I mean, obviously, while you will be very keen to have a bolt on to these platforms as well, but outside these sectors, what are the sectors of interest that you envisage, which will be a large opportunity, and how you are thinking about that as well?
Sure, Manish. So, if for a country like India, any infrastructure sector is a large sector. So, what I would say is we will be sector agnostic. There are certain sectors that will be high on the risk spectrum, and there'll be certain sectors, that will not need too much work, where you can be a passive investor and still enjoy reasonable returns. Uh, so from a sector perspective, we will be agnostic. We have the appetite to solve for complex situations. There is the railways, for example, where we think it's probably the last frontier for private investment in infrastructure, because most other sectors have somehow been touched. Or, for example, gas pipelines is another sector. But what we've also noticed is the mindset, which is now changing, is these are our best assets. Should we really put them out for privatization, or how does this impact the consumer if these assets are privatized? So I do think some of those questions are answered. But the one thing I would really like to see, irrespective of the sector that we are kind of speaking about right now, is to have an independent regulator. Because when you look at, say, something like the railways, where of course there's massive opportunity, because nothing much has happened over the last 10 years. Even if you look at the railway sector globally, there is massive privatization across the US, Europe, etc. But you can't have, for example, the customer, the owner, and the competitor be the same party, right? That creates awkward situations. So I wouldn't want to pick on a sector. I think everything is equally interesting in a particular contract structure that works at different risk-return matrices.
Okay. Saurabh, I mean, picking the same sort of a thread with you as well. I mean, railways, obviously, we all agree is one of a very large sort of a sector. And I mean, NMP also lays down most of the opportunities, the large opportunities on a rail, I mean, power, roads, and railways as a sector. Um, I mean, how do you see that? And Emily mentioned an important point that, I mean, if you look at the other sectors, at least either the sector is evolved or there is a regulator in sort of a place. Whereas somebody like railways, where you're dealing with railways as a counterparty on the other side, do you think, I mean, there are certain aspects like regulation and or let's say a operating body who will actually have something on the likes of what NHI has done when they started actually opening up the sector, the road sector for the private sector. Any thoughts that you have and the views that before they actually come out, or let's say in a meaningful way, there are certain aspects that they have to deal with on a sectors like railways or any other sector that comes to your mind, which will be of interesting play for a private players like yourself. But there are certain actions or certain things which has to be done before it actually gets into the market.
Sure, good point, Manish. Absolutely. I think actually this issue is somewhat tightly related to the previous question with regards to uh, the single centralized agency. And I think the way we are looking at it is whichever sector that has managed to build a process and a system whereby all the core decision making with regards to the strategy, the concession agreement, what should be monetized, how it should be monetized, etc., etc., into a central framework, let's say a SECI or an NHAI style framework, and then disseminate that through that centralized body to various states or various line ministries or the relevant line ministry to take action upon. That will be most attractive. But I agree with Ami as well that we are long-term investors, so no sector is not important. I think every sector in infrastructure is important. At some point in time, opportunities will come in. We recognize that, and we are willing to work. Of course, we have been doing that, but we continue to want to work in establishing, in assisting, an establishment of such centralized nodal bodies, if you will. I think that I think is an important task. We probably need to have more SECIs in a gas sector or in a transmission sector, along with the point Ami made as well, very, very important need for an independent regulator, which doesn't exist in many subsectors today. So yes, I think it's not optimal. This is just a wish list. We recognize it will happen over a period of time.
Okay, okay. I mean, thanks, Saurabh. Uh, I mean, Kavita, other sort of, while obviously there is a overall framework we all agreed at the start, like NMP has come out and laid down clearly. Ultimately, what we are talking in essence is the PPPs, right? I mean, these are all public-private partnerships, irrespective of which sectors we are dealing with, and as a nation, I think right up to, if I recollect, at the center, state, and even the third tier, which is urban local bodies, for example, or a municipal sector or urban infrastructure, we have we have uh, we have a variety of experience around the PPPs, right? Some good, but largely, I think a lot of issues and the challenges that we have seen in lot many projects as well. Now, is there any sort of a top 2 3 items? And I know, I mean, we had a benefit, actually. Unfortunately, we did a very great work through a Kilker committee, and I say unfortunately because I don't see, I mean, many recommendations of that great work actually got implemented. We have talked about it. I don't recollect, at least in my last 20 25 years of infrastructure dealing, that there was a great amount of a work and the expertise that resided through what the Kilker committee suggested on that framework, right? And we are now obviously talking of almost such $1 billion of a play, but essentially it is a PPPs at the end of the day. Now, anything that comes to your top 2 3 points, which is having a must, whether it is a centralized agencies or these line ministries, whoever does that in the consultation with, let's say, Niti Aayog, but those are a must to have, given our past experiences of dealing with some of these PPPs.
Yeah, I think in the broader PPP framework, and I think the P which is most important in that is a partnership framework, right? Where you understand that there are two people who are partnering for an objective, and that who are both committed to that objective being met. And in that context, how are the risks and rewards of this being shared, right? And and I think historically, there have been various issues with various PPPs, and today, a lot of us talk about assets more in the brownfield context. But even if you look at the greenfield context, which is where PPP actually started, the issue was more around either the risk not being properly understood, or not being properly assigned, or being properly assigned but not carried out in the manner in which it was envisaged, right? For instance, if land acquisition and approvals was the responsibility of a certain agency, and that was not provided in a timely manner, and that resulted in certain cost and economic implications, you know the manner in which it should have been executed was that the agencies should have owned up to their part of the obligation, and the person on the other side should have been made good, right? But empirically, but actually practically, we know that it has never been that simple. It's never been very simple to get contracts performed. It's never been very simple to see this play out the way that it is listed in the document, right? So I think that has been one of the key pain points, and one of the key reasons why a lot of investors then moved to the brownfield portion of the action, because they said that, okay, there's at least one or two levels of uncertainty which they can take out of the equation, right? So if we actually need PPP to come back, and PPP to come back and in the greenfield space, I think there needs to be a um, lot more conviction that that the contracts are fair, and if they are fair, that they will actually be performed. And that has that's been consistent messages that we have been given and giving, and I think that continues to be one of the greatest challenges.
And I
It's
think, I
not in
mean,
the conception, it is in the execution.
I think, I mean, that also brings to the fundamental point that some of these contracts, and we are talking right from, let's say, about 20 25 years to even a 50 60 years, 40 years concessions as well. And fundamentally, something or other will come up and will go wrong. You need as I say, an independent institution, which is more of a commercial body rather than a legal sort of a body, which can actually look at the commercial issues that is coming up and take us a little bit of independent view, rather than the authority which is actually at the first place awarding you the contracts. And then you will always have a little bit of a conflict of interest to deal with that. And this body, as a more professional sort of a body, which is what UK has, for example, or a lot of established markets, can be a big sort of a support to the entire private sector capital when they get stuck, and they will get stuck. Given, I mean, you're talking of a long-term sort of a frameworks and the concessions. Ambalika, your thoughts, something that you would want to have, maybe a top 2 3 points that we talked about the contracts. We talk of something as a independent sort of a body on a commercial side, that is anything that comes to your mind, which is also very critical before actually we can see the benefit of everybody agreeing that is a great reform, bold reform, very important, desirable context in the need of a capital, but important to have for the government to think through before they can actually start seeing the real traction across sectors. Anything that comes to your mind or your wish list to the government?
Sure, thanks. I mean, I'm in agreement with what Kavita said. So really, one of the key things is to look at each of the concession agreements, and the key issue there is risk and reward, and is risk being allocated equitably, and is it being allocated fairly in a manner that it, makes it attractive to large pools of capital, whether domestic or international. And that's extremely important to look at it from that perspective. And secondly, also pricing of that risk, of course, and having very, I would say, sensible views on who the investor class is, what is the investor class that they really want to attract to these assets, how do they want these to be distributed amongst that investor class in an ideal situation. I think these are things that are not very well thought through always, and this is a must to ensure success. The also, when I say risk sharing, as we've seen in renewables, SECI and NTPC being set, I mean, as the sort of intermediate agency, really was a game changer. So similarly, depending on the sector and the asset class and the type of investing that you're envisaging, there could be, similar agencies that could be set up, which would really be the fuel and the catalyst. So that is something that one definitely has to look at. And thirdly, again, an independent regulator is very important, and railways, I know, has been mentioned by all of us. Is definitely, if you want to get it going, one of the key requisites. So concession agreement is something that they are addressing now. What came out initially was not acceptable, and they took it back and they're thinking about it. And so now you have to also address the independent regulators. So these are the basic, the cornerstones of PPP projects, and there are enough lessons globally for us to really weigh our options and see what suits our country and our needs the best, and take the best of that. So I would put one more thing I would say is, and this is applicable, say, in case of, it's not so applicable in an InvIT way, or, investing in somebody else's InvIT and you're passive. But, the type of investing that we do, where we are very active investors, and the number of approvals that are required can be huge sometimes, and it takes time. It's not predictable. So I think this is an area that we should address, and this lies with the individual agencies, but it is an area that we must look at and address as we go.
Thank you. I mean, thanks, Malika. I think, I mean, and Saurabh also alluded to that. One thing is very clear, that if this entire reform that we all agree is very different from what has been done in the past, has to really realize its real benefits in terms of the billions of dollars that the government is envisaging through this program. there are some fundamental characters which has to be set right. What SECI, NHI achieved through their own sectors, there could be a need for some of those to really see the traction in the other sectors, which is what Saurabh alluded to in his opening comment, that, while I mean, obviously everybody was excited about it, we are looking forward to it, but on the ground, since the time of announcement, actually you have not seen, I mean, the other sectors really coming out and hitting the ground as well. And that could be one of the things that the government should actually take it back to see that what these entities achieved, which acted as a catalyst, as a medical, the word that you used as well. Now, I think moving to my last sort of this thing, from a buckets point, I wanted to sort of cover, to both Saurabh and Emmy, and let me start with Emmy first. I mean, one of the things that has always been talked about these monetization program by the agencies and the government thought process is that ultimately we are giving you a long-term concessions, we are giving you a brownfield assets, not only just a brownfield assets, they have a demonstrated track record for last 3 to 4 years. So a lot of your risk, I mean, on the business side, you have a good demonstration of what has happened, what has worked, what is not working. And therefore, the return expectations, or the yield that is being expected, or the value out of this expected, is something has to be very competitive. Otherwise, I as an institution, without naming any institution, can raise the money, go out in the market and raise that money. Now, the pool of capital that you access and you bring, I mean, I'm to first go with you, and Saurabh, I will come back with the same question to you as well. Do you really think that this part of because you are taking a greenfield risk out, you are taking a demonstrated track record out, long-term concession, a ticket size which is larger, I mean, that gives you enough confidence that you can attract a pool of capital which will be very, very competitive from a return expectations around these projects and the entire this thing, because that's a very also big incentive which will drive the line ministries to really come out. I can put any framework and the structure, but ultimately they have to see that what they can do through this program and raise capital is very, 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 sort of a cost effective as well for them. So, Amy, your views on that?
Right. So that's an interesting question. So I would say I would start with history is not necessarily how the future will look like. Number one. Well, we can segregate that into tolling kind of projects where you really have pricing and volume risk versus annuity projects where the stream of income is a little more stable. And, yes, there is a differential in pricing that could be considered for these two different types of, assets. But overall, there is still, other than the revenue lines and just getting into the details, your expenses also follow a certain track depending on what happens in the future, and so does your cost on interest, etc. So that being said, if we as active managers could come in and drive some efficiencies to have control over some of these elements, and that's what we are paid for, to be honest, on one side, right? Because that's exactly what generates the alpha. So yes, for a market that is as competitive as it is, the moment there are so many investors in the market, there is someone out there who's going to kind of base that cost of capital at a fairly low rate, which is definitely a benefit to the government. But I would say that your ability to price risk, to have that foresight, to build efficiencies, to source the best cost of debt, etc., as a package can make a massive difference. But end of the day, we all have the experience of investing, and not necessarily that things will move in a certain direction 30 years down or 20 years down, because today you might, buy a toll road thinking your growth is supposed to be X. But if an airport comes up 10 years down, there's nothing most of us on this call can do about it. So I do think it's about taking that calculated call. But at the same time, yes, there is enough capital out there, and hopefully we are doing our jobs well to justify why certain things are investable and certain things are not in certain contract frameworks.
Thanks, Amy. I mean, Saurabh, I mean, your views on the same subject, and please give me a little more. I mean, Amy said that yes, but I mean, she had obviously built a lot of caveats as well. So, Saurabh, try to give me a little more straight answer that whether we will see a very competitive capital coming to these projects, subject to all that we said is taken care of the government. That's a very fair point.
Yeah, look, I think the cost of capital is already very competitive, and beauty is always in the eyes of the beholder, as they say, right? So uh, everyone feels that there is this is a competitive market globally. We are competing against global assets. We're not really competing amongst ourselves in India assets. When we go sit on the global ICs, we are asked the rate of returns compared to the global investments that can happen elsewhere as well. Currency plays a huge part into this, the depreciating currency, which is already a very, very big risk that most of the long-term investors say. So I think the right question is not, are we going to get the competitive capital? I think, to my mind, the right question is, are we creating a very competitive environment to get the best cost of capital or not? And I think that is where, if we can focus from a process perspective, if we focus from a quality of information perspective, if we focus from timelines perspective, there are a lot of these elements which can be run in a very tightly run, smartly run competitive bid process, which can actually fetch in the best possible competitive capital, especially for the brownfield assets, especially under the NMP program. I think if you are running a process which is, uh, let's say, a very, very tight deadlines, whatever it is, the time frame, but your quality of information is excellent, and that makes people give a lot more time and enough sort of ability to assimilate that quality of information and price it properly, rather than doing a 30-day bid timeline and then extending it by another 30 days and extending it another 30 days. And I think that actually, in ironically, it actually increases the cost of capital. What decreases the cost of capital is that, okay, give me 90 days, for example, and I will go and bid, and this timeline is not going to change. And here is the set of information which is available to everybody. So people can go warm up their committees, build out their, because everybody knows it's a very competitive environment. So you have to see yourselves to believe that there's a very competitive environment. So when people spend time, energy, resources in bidding for a binding bid, one shot, uh, they need to have enough comfort, take enough committees along with them to bid for it, and yet try to win. And look, I mean, if you don't win 3 4 times, fourth time, fifth time you go, it's not going to be easy getting that approval, right? So everybody knows that. So I think the right question is, how can we improve the environment of our bidding? And to, I have made this point before as well, and I think I'll make this point again. We really, really need a annualized calendar of these bids, which are, should be publicly put out there. This is the time and this bid will come, this is the time and this bid will come, and so on. And right information, uh, adherence to timelines and process will actually improve the best cost of capital that we can get. That's my point on this.
Very well said, Saurabh. And I think we are almost towards the end. One last question, and a little tougher one, but to Kavita now on this. Kavita, what's happening right now in the global environment, right? I mean, we daily wake up, we see what's happening, what is likely to happen now in the global context of currently the environment we are sitting in. I mean, that brings an element of an uncertainty, even if while we are not directly impacted, but obviously there is a lot of impact of what happens globally around the current scenario and the time it takes to settle it down. Do you believe that from an investors of not specific to you, but a larger sort of investors like yourself, who while are still looking for a long-term assets play, long-term these concessions, but will bring an element of uncertainty to look at something seriously and to be ready to still invest in pending this clarity overall what's happened in the global environment?
Yeah, I think Manish, actually in the given context, it certainly helps to be long term, right? Because if you weren't a long term investor, let's just look at it in the context of the road sector, right? Which has been at the cusp of many things which have happened. You know, whether it's the demonetization, the GST, GDP growth, the COVID situation, and now, of course, you know, the concern that we see on oil prices and what that augurs for inflation, GDP, currency, and what have you, right? And if you just take the last 5 years as a block, if you were a short-term investor, you know, you would have just lost your entire conviction to invest in the sector, because you would have just seen the red every year, right? The point that you are looking at a much longer term horizon, And that doesn't mean that you don't have short-term discipline. If you're seeing that, there are headwinds and those headwinds are permanent headwinds as opposed to, economic cycles or inflation cycles or COVID cycles, you would certainly say that, okay, this sector, it doesn't make sense for me to be invested in this anymore. But the advantage of being long-term is that you are able to see whether fundamentally there is, something has changed. And if that fundamental has not changed, you can take a very rational decision about whether I need to invest more, whether I need to get out, or whether I just hold where I am. So I would just say that it doesn't mean that all of these headwinds do not impact us, but then they cause us to go back to the drawing board, look at our strategy, see if something has fundamentally shifted, whether we need a change in approach, whether we even need to sell our assets and get out. And that, I think, is the benefit. You have the benefit of holding for the long term. That's an available option. So that's it.
Thanks, Kavita. Very well answered. So I think we have reached the end of our session. Thank you, every one of you, each one of you. I think I thought we covered pretty much the key aspects of this entire program around that. So thanks again. For the panelists, over to you, Akriti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Manish, for this excellent moderation with the industry solvers.